Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA Live from the Phoenix Park Hotel and the Hold Their Feet to the Fire event brought to you by FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. And we're so thankful to all the good people from FAIR for providing our hotel room and also the facilities here to be able to broadcast to you. They've been doing that for a long time. One of the nice things about FAIR, though, too, is that they don't tell you what to say. That's called First Amendment. And if that were the case, we wouldn't be here. So we're very appreciative of the fact to be able to talk about immigration as well as a lot of other subjects. And one of the guys that talks about these kind of things all the time is a senior congressional correspondent from the Washington Examiner. His name is David Drucker, and he came to Washington from California, where he was the senior congressional correspondent for the with the Los Angeles Daily News at that point in time. And now he lives on Capitol Hill, although he doesn't get to wear the little pin around, right?
No pins.
No pins.
But no traffic.
No traffic. And so your commute to here was like, what, 2 minutes?
Basically, yeah. Okay. And my commute home will be about a minute and a half.
David, talk a little bit about, being a reporter for the Examiner and exactly where the Examiner fits into the whole pantheon of, people that are reporting news around the country.
Well, look, what we try and do is give people a perspective on Washington and why it's relevant to them. We also try, what I try and do in my campaign coverage, which I'm focused on a lot right now, is to figure out, what's going to happen, particularly in the Republican primary, and why it's going to happen, and how these candidates are going to do with voters, and why they're either going to do well or not do well with voters. But it's always about, I think, giving an analysis and perspective that you can walk away from a story having learned something, and not just been given an argument, he said, she said, which has its place, but there's plenty of that. We try and give people a reason to come and read us.
2 days ago, I had Cheryl Atkinson on, who used to be a reporter, obviously an investigative reporter, I'm sure you're well aware, from CBS. And so as a reporter, what's the most important thing for you when you go out to report on various things and you're watching, for example, a race like you're doing right now with the Republican nominations?
I want to be accurate, I want to be fair, but I want to get the context right. It's very important. I mean, you could talk about anything, but if you don't give people the context of behind the facts, then I think you're missing something. I want to find things that are happening and connect dots. One of the favorite stories I did this cycle, and it just happens to play into immigration this cycle. You can see how I talk here in D.C. One of my favorite stories so far this year, calendar year, I decided to call a bunch of Republicans and conservatives in Iowa and just say, what about immigration? Is it a deal breaker or not?
Yeah.
And, they talked to me about their feelings of immigration, how it played in terms of other issues, what they thought of various candidates. And I came away with I was able to, I thought, deliver a story that was insightful and educational and didn't necessarily tell people what the conventional wisdom suggested. That's what I try and do, is go after the right people who are reflective of what's going on and deliver a story that is contextually accurate.
It's interesting to put it in context, because the first thing people will say when you go to and challenge them, say, well, it took me out of context. Well, maybe not. But the idea is that, right now we're having this debate in the country, and Republicans are really on the defensive at the moment because they're trying to figure out a way to, I think, to fashion some narrative that makes sense. And they seem to be very awkward with them. Am I wrong on that?
What subject matter?
On immigration, staying with immigration.
Well, I think the reason they can be awkward on immigration is because the party's split. There's not a lot of disagreement right now in the Republican Party about Iran and Israel, for instance, and Vladimir Putin and taxes, and I could go on down the line, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, find me a Republican who's going to propose a tax increase, and I'll give you $1 million. You go talk to Republicans across the country about the issue of immigration, and you are going to get a lot of different opinions. And so the party, when you have a political party or a movement that's not in lockstep, it's going to sound disjointed and awkward.
What's the tipping point on the immigration one? Because immigration, as I said this morning with a couple other people, is the one illegal thing in our country that we seem to not care about if it's illegal. And it's, we get the human aspect of it and we get the law aspect of it. We don't seem to be able to find a happy medium somewhere in between. And we have a lot of ulterior motives, I think, as to why we want to make illegal legal. So how do we take that whole jumble of stuff and make any sense out of it, Dave?
It's very difficult. I think, look, part of the challenge is that you have 11 to 12 million illegal immigrants in the United States.
Right.
And even the staunchest opponents of amnesty or anything resembling amnesty, at least on Capitol Hill, I haven't seen them produce legislation that would that would appropriate money and create a system to go find all of them and deport them. So even the staunchest opponents of immigration, of amnesty in Washington, aren't proposing mass deportations. Well, so then the question becomes, if you're not going to provide them a way to get right with the law, I'm not saying you should, but if you're not, then how, then what do you plan to do to fix all of this? And that's on that side. And then you have the people who, are for comprehensive immigration reform and legalization, but they talk about border security without really telling you what their version of border security is, or they'll tell you that it's already secure. And my point is, there are so many, it is such a complicated issue, fraught with so much political risk, that it has been really hard for the political parties and individual politicians on both sides to come together on a consensus position that can run the gauntlet all the way to a presidential signature.
You just said something that's really important, I think, in this whole conversation. You live in a town where politics is the main business in this town. There's no question about it. And you talk about political risk. For most people that sit out there in our neck of the woods and they'll say, okay, what's the right and wrong of it? And that's it. And then they'll say, well, I believe it, I don't believe it. I think, we ought to meld these people in somehow. Politicians go to another place and they say, well, I got to be elected next time. I've got to, and obviously they're listening to their constituents, but they're also trying to figure out, what's the best thing to do here in terms of my own self-preservation. I mean, that is part of it, right?
Well, of course it's part of it. As I like to say.
That's the reality.
Look, I love to do this when I give talks to people, and they say, well, why don't they just do what's right? Why do they get so political? So I asked a member of the audience, like, do you like your job? Well, yeah. Do you want to come to work tomorrow? Well, of course. Yeah, well, so do they.
Yeah.
And there's the human element there. But by the way, that also reflects constituencies. So they're worried about losing re-election. What they're really saying is the people who elect me may not like what I'm about to do, so I don't know if I want to cross them. And it's so funny to hear voters. On the one hand, they want these guys and ladies to just do what's right, regardless of the politics. On the other hand, how come you're not listening to me and doing what I say?
Exactly.
So pick. You either want them to lead and do what they think is right, regardless of risk, or you want them to listen to you. Which is it?
You get the advantage of talking to people in moments where they may let their guard down a little bit, or they might say, off the record, here's what I think. Do you get a sense that they really are concerned about this? I mean, we hear a lot of things. Okay, Republicans want to get votes because of cheap labor. Democrats want to get votes because, and so you hear all that stuff. But beyond that, take me inside the reporter's kind of narrative with them, and what are they saying to you?
So this always seems to surprise people, but I swear to God, most of them are just doing what they either think is right, or at least, at the very least, what they think is important to their constituents. Yes, there are political operatives, for instance, on the left, who go, geez, if we could legalize all these guys,
a lot of votes.
That's a lot of votes. Yeah. Or there are, I'm sure there are business groups that are like, I mean, we've got to compete with China and all of this cheap labor in Asia, so if we can just get these. But by and large, actually, what members of Congress are trying to do is just solve a problem. And there are Republicans, for instance, who just believe that immigration is good, that competition for labor is good, and it's dynamic, and they think that's what really helped America become an economic power in the 20th century, is all of the immigration from Europe and Asia. Then, of course, you have Democrats who look at all of the human stories about people that are not lawbreakers, right, other than breaking the law in coming here, that are, working as, maids or gardeners, in jobs like that. They're illegal, but they pay their rent. They're otherwise law-abiding. And they have to kind of hide in the shadows, and they have kids who maybe they brought here, and the kid didn't decide to break the law, and now they're getting an education but living in the shadows, and they just want to help these people. So there actually is, if you get the politics out of it, and you get the sort of interest groups and the political professionals out of it, this desire to fix a problem. And it's, again, because of everything surrounding the problem, the politics of it, it's been hard for them to reach a consensus. But I think, maybe I'm probably a minority here, I just think way too much is made of this special interests who are trying to manipulate immigration for all sorts of nefarious purposes, even though they may have nefarious benefits.
We're talking with David Drucker, senior congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner, who lives right here on Capitol Hill. It's interesting to me as I watch our generations go by right now, how our arguments are starting to change a little bit. For example, the baby boomer generation, which once dominated the whole center part of the conversation, is now moving kind of the north end. You got the millennials coming in on the south end. You got the X generation, or they're in between there, and you've got all these different parts looking at life in a much different way, where the baby boomers might have said, well, we got some absolutes here. The other generation is saying, well, there's a little bit more gray to us, It's got to be interesting reporting, too, as you watch the members come through Congress in the same kind of way as the older members, the younger ones coming in, and somewhere in between. We're
seeing that particularly with the issues, I think, of same-sex marriage and whether marijuana should be legal. And God, I mean, I'm Generation X. I'm going to be 44 this year, which feels ancient, right? But not if you're a baby boomer.
I'm a baby boomer, so
yet,
there you go.
And yet the millennials are coming in behind me. And, I grew up in a world where when I was growing up, marijuana would not be legal, and the state would only sanction a marriage between a man and a woman, and now things are changing. What's interesting is to watch politics change, and from my perspective, to be aware that politics on some issues are changing because people are changing. I say this all the time, but if you look at a lot of college age and middle 20-something age voters who consider themselves conservatives and usually vote Republican, they tend to be more inclined to be a supporter of same-sex marriage.
Right.
And, not being as hard line on illicit drugs is another, part of the sort of changing nature of how generations look at this stuff. So, yeah, it changes, and you have to kind of be aware of that, especially as one group of voters sort of, as you just said, fades into the background.
Right.
Because not to be crass about it, but people pass.
Yeah, they do.
And new voters come in behind them, and you don't have the voters you used to have because they've left us.
Well, and their impact changes. I mean, that's it. I mean, your impact changes. You say, okay, do I need that group as much as I used to need them before? And then there's a new predominant way of thinking in the country. And a lot of people at my age, and I guess, I don't know if it happens at the X generation, you say, damn, they're not worth a cent behind us, right? We always say, when I was a boy, when I was a girl, and, we climbed up hills, 110-degree heat. We didn't even have legs there. We just we dragged ourselves up, we get into that kind of syndrome, and it's kind of interesting to watch all that happening right now before our eyes, especially for talk show hosts and reporters, I would think.
I'm doing the same thing, though. I mean, my friends and I, we're all around the same age, sit around and we talk about how, when we came up and took entry-level jobs, we worked, we have this discussion. We were just grateful for the job, and we were using it to get ahead, and we didn't ask about what's my vacation time and what are my benefits, and now people come in and they want to know, well, what are my benefits and what is my vacation time, and we just tend to think like, what is it with kids today?
Yeah.
And we sound just like you.
Well, we walk by, we see the blue hair, the wild things, and we say, oh, come on, what are you? And the tattoos everywhere, and you go, oh my God! I mean, what happens when that eagle turns into a seagull? And you look at all that stuff, and you just say, geez. So, we find ourselves doing that. We didn't want to become our dads, but that's what happens here along the way. I want to take a break. Having a great conversation here with David Drucker this morning, senior congressional correspondent, Washington Examiner. We're going to talk a little bit more about immigration, but also about the state of reporting in the news media when we come back. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show, live from the Phoenix Park Hotel and the FAIR event. They hold their feet to the fire event held by the Federation for American Immigration Reform. You can follow them at fairus.org to stay up with some of the issues they're following. We're back with David Drucker, senior congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner. David, I want to ask you about two things here. We hear an awful lot about the Main Street media, and that they are really having an effect on how people make policy, and that they become part of the story instead of reporting the story many times. You're a guy that's out there reporting this story. How do you feel about it when you hear people say that?
Well, on the one hand, I understand frustrations because, look, there are times when the media doesn't get the story right or doesn't ask the right questions so that we can tell the full and proper story. On the other hand, I think that the idea that this is a product of deliberate bias, I think that charge is overblown just because I see how people work. I think there are times when it's an issue of worldview and what you know, so that if you're reporting on economic policy but you've never run a business, you just may not know what the right questions are to ask, or you may not it may not make sense to you that raising taxes across the board is going to be a problem for sole proprietorships who file as individuals, but it's just because you don't, it's not because you know that but are choosing to ignore it. It's because you just don't know.
Not your area of expertise.
Right. So that's on us because we're supposed to get the story right. But I think that sometimes it's an issue of what we know and not knowing enough to ask the right questions.
Let me ask you this question. We watched the White House pool. I've had a chance to be in the pool a couple of times on some occasions. And one of the things that's interesting is we always say, ask the next question. You know, like the president said this over here, now he's saying this over here, or maybe a congressman or a senator said this over here, now they're saying this over here. How did they morph into that? As a reporter, you know, how do you... Is there a matter of being cowed by power sometimes where you can't ask it or you're afraid you're not going to be in the pool anymore or anything like that? I'm not asking you specifically, but in general.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, most reporters actually, it makes their day if they get into a fight with a politician. You know, I've been yelled at a couple of times, and it was like a badge of honor. I may not have told everybody the story just out of respect to the fact that it was a private conversation, but it certainly didn't make me feel bad. You know, I think for me personally, the issue is find the people who know what's going on, even if nobody's ever heard of them.
Yeah.
Don't just go to the people who I know will give me a quote.
Right.
So I'm always looking for the people who know what's going on, and you know, part of it is just me. I mean, I read and I look and I kind of decide. I think there's a story here. Let me ask the right questions. But you know, I make choices because there are times when somebody says this is the way it is, but other people tell me it's not, and it's a judgment call. Well, I'm not going with that story, even though that person tells me it's the story, because I don't buy it. It doesn't even mean maybe they think it's true, but you know, at the end of the day, I'm going to be judged by my work. So if I write something with my name on it and it's all wrong, people are going to tell me. But my goal is to be right. My goal isn't to do anybody favors.
Right. You know, it's interesting. We always, I talk to reporters sometimes, and they're always looking for that Woodward Bernstein moment, you know, where they have that small story that started out and it leads to somewhere big and a president steps down or whatever it might be. Do you ever have a Woodward Bernstein moment? Is that somewhere in the back of your mind, or is it just a matter of, hey, I want to get it right today, and that's all that really matters?
So for me, it's the latter. I think it's the second option you gave me. But here's the thing: I wasn't always a reporter. I got into this after a few years in business, just because I thought it was so fascinating and fun. My goal has my approach has always been that it's not my job to change the world or bring anybody down or bring anybody up. My job is to tell a story, tell it correctly, and whatever people do with it or don't do with it, that's up to them. So I want my stuff to be read.
So you're not the scorekeeper.
It's not my job. No. Well, I would say this. As an analyst, this is where people do get mad at me. I will give you a sort of an opinion in that this is what I see happening and why, which is based on reporting and my informed knowledge.
Right.
And I have to live with that. But I'm not doing it for any particular reason. Now, that's just my approach to journalism, as opposed to, you know, but I like it. It's selfish. My whole professional career depends on being right more often than I'm wrong, so people will pay me to produce this stuff. That's just, I think, a good approach. I think when you're writing with when you're reporting news with the intention of having a particular societal outcome, it's where you know, as a human being, could find yourself wanting to produce a particular story because that's the story you think needs to be told. I tell stories that I want to tell, as long as my editor also agrees
that you want to tell them.
And I hope people find them interesting, and that's what I do.
Final thing I wanted to ask you about, we've got candidates coming out right now. I saw you on TV the other night. You were down in Lucky Guy, having to cover it down in Florida. You've got Rubio coming out right now. You've got three other candidates, interesting, all who were first-termers in terms of being senators. You've got Hillary Clinton out there. You got a lot of people competing in the Republican Party eventually for this nomination. You have one right now so far that we know of in the Democratic Party. That may change a little bit later on. As you watch right now with the Republicans, and you and I were talking off air before, it's interesting to see who's going to emerge from this whole group. What are your thoughts so far?
You know, it's a very deep competitive field. I mean, it's something we didn't see in 2012. In 2012 with the Republicans, what you saw was Mitt Romney and a bunch of political Lilliputians. Yeah. You know, all good people, meant well, but very few, other than Romney, maybe none of them, could really be seen as presidents by a general election audience. this Republican primary, you've got sitting and former governors. You've got 3 senators so far that represent the next generation of the Republican Party in many different forms, with national followings that they have cultivated. And so I think it's going to be a very interesting presidential primary debate season to see all of them on the stage fighting it out and talking about their different approaches to policy and what they would do as president. And I think actually it's as probably tough a primary it's going to be, and I expect you'll see the brickbats. It'll serve Republicans well in this regard. There'll be a lot of people on stage that people will be able to see possible presidents, and I don't think that hurts them.
Okay.
And look, Hillary Clinton, on the one hand, you don't want a primary because you just want to focus on the general. You start raising money, and you don't have to worry about being torn down by your own party. On the other hand, even Democrats, and people forget this, Democrats are as angry at Washington as Republicans. But when you own the White House, those kind of criticisms are muted because, hey, you got the White House.
Yeah.
So as Democrats look ahead to their future post-Obama, you're going to see the same sort of populist, anti-establishment strain within their party as you've seen. It'll take different political forms, but you're going to see that with Democrats the way you've seen that with Republicans since Obama was elected, and therefore Hillary's going to have to work very hard to keep her party on board behind her in the sense that they're going to work hard for her and show up for her, and it's going to be interesting.
Just saw an interesting piece this morning in USA Today. I was kind of glancing through, and it said Democrats envious of Republicans for having choices. So they're you may see that narrative play out along the way as well.
I think so, and I think this is a product, by the way, of as successful as Obama was in 2 presidential elections, and he was very successful politically in producing a coalition and delivering votes. The 2010 and 2014 elections for Republicans just demolished the Democratic bench across the country. So instead of having half a dozen sitting and former Democratic governors that could be in position to challenge Clinton, legitimately challenge her, instead of having some new generation Democrats, whether they represented the Obama strain of the party or the old Clinton strain of the party or whatever, they're just gone.
Yeah.
And you saw a lot of U.S. senators disappeared from the Democratic Party in 2010, 2014. And the result is a presidential primary where Clinton pretty much is the de facto nominee unless you think Martin O'Malley is going to pull a fast one and oust her.
Well, and will you have the rabid attention that you had with Obama? Do you keep those voters involved as much for this next election? David, it's fascinating talking to you. I hope we can do it again soon, and thanks for taking the time to be with us here this morning.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
We'll look forward to it. David Drucker with us here on the Gary Sutton Show, the senior congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner.